The guard tower sentries at Forward Operating Base Crimson couldn't believe their eyes. Through the shimmering heat waves of the Syrian desert, a figure emerged from the wasteland, carrying two unconscious men across her shoulders. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was that Emily Carter had been officially declared killed in action 72 hours earlier. Her commanding officers had already signed the condolence letters to her family back in Boston. The memorial service was scheduled for the following week. Yet, here she was, this 5 feet 4 inches American communication specialist who'd been deemed too fragile for combat operations, walking through the front gates with 2 wounded Navy SEALs she'd somehow pulled from behind enemy lines. What happened next would force an entire military command to confront everything they thought they knew about strength, courage, and who deserved to be called a warrior. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The morning briefing at Forward Operating Base Crimson started at 0530 hours, but Emily Carter had been monitoring radio frequencies since 0300 hours. She sat in the cramped communications bunker, her slight frame hunched over banks of radio equipment that hummed and crackled with encrypted chatter from operations across the region. At 23, with her auburn hair always pulled back in regulation fashion and her Boston accent still thick despite 2 years of deployment, Emily was the kind of person who disappeared into backgrounds and equipment rooms. The other soldiers called her Ghost behind her back, though not unkindly. She had an uncanny ability to appear wherever technical problems needed solving, to intercept communications that others missed, and to disappear just as quietly when the real action began. Her personnel file read like a technical manual. Fluent in Arabic, Farsi, and Kurdish, certified in advanced radio operations, expert in satellite communications, and holder of the highest security clearances. What it didn't mention was that she'd grown up in the rough neighborhoods of Boston, where being small meant learning to be smart, fast, and invisible. The base had been her home for 14 months. And in that time, Emily had become the invisible backbone of communications operations. She knew every frequency used by friendly forces within a 200-mile radius, could troubleshoot equipment failures that left senior technicians baffled, and had an intuitive understanding of how enemy forces communicated that had prevented 3 major ambushes. But when the briefings began and missions were assigned, Emily remained in her corner with her headphones and notebooks, monitoring other people's heroism. Captain James Walker stood at the front of the briefing room, his American accent cutting through the morning desert heat as he outlined the day's operations. Walker was everything Emily wasn't. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a commanding presence that made people stand straighter when he entered a room. He'd been skeptical of having a female communication specialist attached to his forward operating base, though he'd never said so directly. His doubts came through in smaller ways, in how he assigned her to monitoring duties while male counterparts got field assignments, in how her suggestions were acknowledged but rarely implemented. Intelligence indicates increased enemy movement in Sector Charlie, Walker announced, pointing to a map covered in red zones and blue friendly positions. SEAL Team Bravo will conduct reconnaissance at coordinates 345267. Communication support will be provided by Sergeant Lee from the primary bunker. Emily looked up from her notes, catching sight of Lee nodding confidently from across the room. Lee was competent, but he didn't speak Kurdish and had never worked with SEAL teams before. The sector Walker had identified was known for its complex communication challenges, with terrain that interfered with standard radio frequencies and local populations that often used the same channels as friendly forces. She raised her hand tentatively. "Sir, that sector has significant radio interference due to the mineral deposits in the hillsides. The standard frequencies won't penetrate reliably. I've been monitoring the area and I've identified alternative channels that would provide clearer communication with SEAL teams." Walker glanced at her with polite disinterest. "Thank you, Carter. We'll keep that in mind if we encounter difficulties. Lee has handled SEAL communications before." The dismissal stung, but not as much as it once would have. Emily had learned to expect it. Her expertise was acknowledged in theory, but rarely trusted in practice. The assumption seemed to be that someone who looked like her, who spoke quietly and preferred technical work to physical training, couldn't possibly understand the complexities of combat operations. What they didn't know was that Emily had been studying those complexities obsessively for over a year. Every night after her official duties ended, she reviewed after-action reports, studied terrain maps, and analyzed communication patterns from successful and failed operations. She had created detailed profiles of enemy communication networks, mapped dead zones where standard radios failed, and developed contingency protocols for situations that hadn't yet occurred. Her personal foot locker contained maps, frequency guides, and tactical analysis that went far beyond anything required for her assigned duties. She called it being prepared. Others might have called it presumptuous. As the briefing concluded and personnel filed out to their assignments, Emily returned to her communications bunker. Through her headphones, she monitored the usual chatter: logistics updates, weather reports, routine check-ins from patrols. But underneath the standard traffic, she detected something else. Faint signals and frequencies that weren't supposed to be active, using patterns that suggested coordination rather than random communication. Someone was planning something in Sector Charlie, and it wasn't friendly forces. She spent the next 2 hours analyzing the signals, cross-referencing them with known enemy communication protocols, and mapping their origins. The picture that emerged made her stomach tighten with anxiety. There was going to be an ambush in Sector Charlie, precisely where SEAL Team Bravo was heading for their reconnaissance mission. The enemy had somehow learned about the mission timing and route. Emily documented her findings carefully, including frequency analysis, signal triangulation, and tactical assessment. Then she walked to Captain Walker's office, her heart pounding as she prepared to interrupt his planning session with information that could save lives. This was her moment to prove that her technical expertise translated into operational value, that being overlooked didn't mean being wrong. Captain Walker looked up from his tactical planning session as Emily knocked on his office door, her manila folder of analysis clutched against her chest like armor. 3 other officers sat around his desk, their conversation halting as she entered. She recognized Major Harris from Base Intelligence, Lieutenant Parker from Operations, and Sergeant First Class Martinez from the SEAL Liaison Team. All of them turned to look at her with expressions ranging from mild curiosity to barely concealed impatience. "Sir," Emily began, her Boston accent more pronounced under stress, "I've detected enemy communications suggesting an imminent ambush in Sector Charlie, directly along SEAL Team Bravo's planned reconnaissance route." She opened her folder and spread her frequency analysis across the desk, pointing to the signal patterns she'd been tracking. These transmissions began approximately 40 minutes after this morning's briefing ended. The timing suggests they have intelligence about our operation. Major Harris leaned forward, studying her documents with professional interest. "What's your confidence level on this analysis, Specialist Carter?" he asked, using her rank rather than her name in a way that suggested he wasn't entirely certain who she was, despite having served on the same base for over a year. "Very high, sir. The signal patterns match known enemy coordination protocols, and the frequency choices indicate they're trying to avoid our standard monitoring procedures. They're using Kurdish linguistic markers that suggest local militia involvement, which would explain how they obtained intelligence about our planned operation." Emily's voice grew more confident as she explained her technical findings, the familiar territory of radio analysis grounding her despite the intimidating audience. Lieutenant Parker frowned, tapping his pen against the desk. "Carter, isn't your assignment monitoring base communications rather than tactical intelligence gathering?" The question carried an edge that suggested she was overstepping boundaries rather than providing valuable information. "Yes, sir," Emily Carter said, her voice steady, but she could feel the familiar pattern beginning. Her expertise would be questioned not on its merits, but on whether she was authorized to possess it. Captain James Walker studied her documents, his expression unreadable. "This is interesting work, Carter, but SEAL Team Bravo has their own intelligence support. If there were genuine threats in Sector Charlie, they would have identified them through proper channels." He began gathering her papers, a polite but firm dismissal. "I appreciate your initiative, Carter, but operational intelligence needs to come through established procedures." "Sir," Emily pressed, knowing she was risking insubordination but unable to let it go, "the signals I've detected are using frequencies that standard intelligence gathering doesn't monitor. They're specifically chosen to avoid our typical surveillance. If SEAL Team Bravo proceeds as planned, they're walking into a prepared ambush." Sergeant Martinez, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "With respect, Specialist, SEAL teams don't need protection from communications personnel. These guys have been operating in hostile territory for years. They know how to handle themselves. His tone wasn't unkind, but it carried the unmistakable message that she was out of her depth. The dismissal hit Emily like a familiar slap. Once again, her technical competence was being overshadowed by assumptions about her role and capabilities. She was the communication specialist who was supposed to stay in her bunker and relay messages, not the tactical analyst who could identify threats and save lives. The fact that she was right didn't matter as much as the fact that being right wasn't considered part of her job. "Yes, sir," she said quietly, collecting her papers. As she turned to leave, she caught Major Harris's eye. He looked almost apologetic, as if he recognized the value of her analysis but couldn't override the established hierarchy that kept communication specialists in supporting roles rather than operational ones. Back in her communications bunker, Emily tried to focus on routine monitoring duties, but her attention kept drifting to the frequencies where she had detected the enemy coordination. The signals were getting stronger and more frequent, suggesting that whatever was being planned was approaching execution. She checked the mission timeline. SEAL Team Bravo was scheduled to depart in 2 hours. She made one more attempt, this time going directly to the communications officer who supervised her work. Captain Laura Bennett had always been fair, treating Emily's technical expertise with appropriate respect, even if she didn't fully understand its implications. Bennett listened to Emily's concerns with genuine attention, but her response was predictably institutional. "Emily, your analysis is impressive, but you have to understand the chain of command. Intelligence assessments go through intelligence channels. If you've identified a genuine threat, the proper procedure is to document it and forward it through Major Harris's office for evaluation." Bennett's voice carried the weariness of someone who had navigated military bureaucracy long enough to know that being right wasn't always enough. "But ma'am, by the time it goes through proper channels, SEAL Team Bravo will already be in the field. The window for preventing this ambush is closing." Bennett sighed, recognizing the genuine distress in Emily's voice. "I'll make some informal inquiries. See if I can get someone to take a second look at your analysis. But Emily, you need to understand that your job is monitoring and relay, not tactical assessment. People have to stay in their lanes, or the whole system breaks down." Staying in her lane, the phrase that had defined Emily's entire military career. She was too small for infantry, too quiet for leadership, too technical for operations. Everyone had a lane for her, and it was always narrower than her capabilities and smaller than her ambitions. She had accepted it for over a year, telling herself that serving in any capacity was honorable, that supporting others was as valuable as leading them. But now, listening to the enemy communications growing stronger while SEAL Team Bravo prepared for what might be their last mission, staying in her lane felt like complicity in disaster. Emily stared at her radio equipment, at the frequencies that told a story no one wanted to hear from someone they didn't expect to understand warfare. She thought about the SEALs she'd never met, but whose lives might depend on information only she possessed. At 1,400 hours, she watched through her bunker window as SEAL Team Bravo loaded into their vehicles for transport to the insertion point. 2 men whose names she didn't know, whose faces she'd only seen in passing, heading toward an ambush she was powerless to prevent through proper channels. The radio traffic on enemy frequencies had reached a crescendo, clearly indicating that the trap was set and waiting. Emily made a decision that would change everything. If staying in her lane meant watching people die, then maybe it was time to find a different lane. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. What Captain Walker and the other officers didn't know was that Emily Carter had been preparing for moments like this her entire deployment. While her official duties kept her anchored to the communications bunker, her unofficial education had taken her far beyond radio frequencies and satellite uplinks. Every spare moment had been invested in becoming the kind of soldier she'd never been allowed to be. The transformation had begun during her first week at Forward Operating Base Crimson when she'd witnessed a medical evacuation that had gone wrong due to communication failures. The helicopter couldn't establish reliable contact with ground forces. The wounded soldier's condition deteriorated during the delays, and what should have been a routine extraction became a near disaster. Emily had watched from her bunker, knowing she could have provided the technical solution that would have prevented the complications. But protocol demanded she stay at her assigned station monitoring base communications. That night, she'd made a decision that would define her entire deployment. If the military wasn't going to train her for the situations where lives depended on her expertise, she'd train herself. The base library became her second home, filled with tactical manuals, medical guides, and survival handbooks that she studied until the words blurred together. She memorized evacuation procedures, learned to read terrain maps with the precision of an infantry officer, and studied enemy tactics with the dedication of an intelligence analyst. But reading wasn't enough. During her off-duty hours, when the desert heat made outdoor activities nearly unbearable, Emily found ways to train. The base gymnasium became her proving ground, where she pushed her small frame through workouts designed for soldiers twice her size. She couldn't match their raw strength, but she discovered that endurance, flexibility, and mental toughness could compensate for physical limitations in ways that surprised even her. The real breakthrough came when she convinced Corporal Daniel Foster, a Special Forces medic on temporary assignment, to teach her advanced field medicine. Foster had initially been skeptical of training someone whose official duties didn't require medical knowledge, but Emily's persistence and obvious intelligence had won him over. Under his informal tutelage, she learned to treat gunshot wounds, perform emergency surgery with improvised equipment, and stabilize patients for transport under combat conditions. "You've got steady hands and a good head for this," Foster had told her during one of their clandestine training sessions. "Why aren't you in the medical corps?" The question had stung because it reminded Emily of all the applications she'd submitted for advanced training, all the requests that had been politely denied because her current role was considered too essential to interrupt. She was too valuable as a communication specialist to be allowed to become anything else. Her most audacious preparation had been learning Arabic and Kurdish beyond the basic conversational level required for her position. Using language learning software she'd purchased with her own money and conversation practice with local interpreters, Emily had achieved near fluency in both languages. She could understand not just the words being spoken on intercepted communications, but the cultural contexts, the regional dialects, and the subtle implications that revealed tactical intentions. The language skills had proven invaluable during her unauthorized intelligence gathering. While official translators worked from transcripts and recordings, Emily Carter could listen to live communications and understand not just what was being said, but what wasn't being said. She developed profiles of individual enemy commanders based on their speech patterns, had mapped communication networks by recognizing voice signatures, and had identified operational patterns that escaped notice in formal intelligence reports. Her personal foot locker contained evidence of this secret curriculum. Detailed maps she'd hand-drawn of the surrounding terrain marked with radio dead zones, potential ambush sites, and evacuation routes. Medical supplies she'd quietly acquired through unofficial channels, enough to treat multiple casualties in field conditions. Combat equipment that wasn't part of her official gear allocation, purchased through personal funds and justified as recreational equipment to avoid questions. The supply sergeant knew she could be trusted with sensitive materials. The mechanics knew she understood their equipment better than most technicians. The medics knew she had genuine expertise in their field. What none of them knew was how all these separate competencies were connected in Emily's mind into a comprehensive understanding of how to conduct operations that officially didn't concern her. She'd studied every mission conducted from the base during her deployment, analyzing what had worked, what had failed, and how better preparation might have changed outcomes. She'd wargamed scenarios in her mind, imagining herself in situations where her combined skills might make the difference between success and disaster. The irony wasn't lost on her that all this preparation was considered inappropriate because it exceeded her assigned duties, while the same preparation in someone else would be praised as initiative and professional development. The difference was that others were expected to grow beyond their initial roles, while she was expected to remain safely contained in narrow boundaries that others had determined were appropriate for someone of her size and background. As she monitored the enemy communications that afternoon, listening to the coordination for an ambush that no one else would believe was happening, Emily realized that all her preparation had led to this moment. She possessed the language skills to understand the threat, the tactical knowledge to assess its implications, the medical training to treat casualties, and the technical expertise to coordinate a response. She was, in every meaningful sense, qualified to act. The hours following her failed warning to command stretched like a torture session for Emily. She sat in her communications bunker, surrounded by the familiar hum of radio equipment, watching the digital clock tick toward the moment when SEAL Team Bravo would walk into what she was certain was a carefully prepared ambush. Every 15 minutes, she swept the enemy frequencies again, and each time the signals grew stronger, more coordinated, more obviously threatening. At 1,530 hours, she made one final attempt through official channels. This time, she bypassed Captain Walker entirely and went directly to Major Harris's office, armed with additional frequency analysis and a detailed tactical assessment that she'd prepared during her lunch break. Harris's aide, Sergeant Davis, looked at her with barely concealed irritation when she requested an urgent meeting. Specialist Carter, Major Harris is in a classified briefing. Unless this is a life-threatening emergency, you'll need to schedule an appointment through proper channels. Davis's tone suggested that communication specialists didn't typically have information that qualified as life-threatening emergencies. It is a life-threatening emergency, Sergeant. I have intelligence indicating that SEAL Team Bravo is heading into an ambush, and the window for preventing it is closing. Emily kept her voice steady, but she could feel desperation creeping into her words. She was running out of time and running out of people who might listen. Davis studied her for a moment, clearly weighing whether to interrupt his superior's meeting for what might be the concerns of an overeager communications specialist. I'll pass along your request, but I can't promise anything. The major's schedule is completely full today. The dismissal was polite but final. Even in claiming to help, he was making it clear that her concerns weren't urgent enough to disrupt more important business. Emily returned to her bunker, feeling the familiar burn of institutional dismissal. But this time, it was accompanied by something new. A growing awareness that the system she'd trusted to protect soldiers was actively preventing her from protecting them. Her expertise was being filtered through layers of bureaucracy, each layer adding delay and skepticism until the original urgency was lost in procedural requirements and jurisdictional concerns. The breaking point came at 1,645 hours when Captain Bennett stopped by her bunker to deliver what she thought was good news. Emily, I spoke with Major Harris's office about your intelligence concerns. He's agreed to have someone review your analysis after the current operation is completed. If your assessment proves accurate, it will be incorporated into future mission planning. Bennett's smile suggested she thought she'd solved the problem through proper channels. Ma'am, Emily replied, struggling to keep her voice level. SEAL Team Bravo inserts in 45 minutes. By the time someone reviews my analysis, it will be too late to prevent whatever's going to happen to them. The frustration that had been building all day finally began to show in her voice, and she saw Bennett's expression shift from helpful to concerned. Specialist Carter, I understand you're passionate about your work, but you need to trust that people with more experience than you are making the tactical decisions. Your job is to provide communication support, not to second-guess operational planning. Bennett's tone had become more formal, carrying the subtle warning that Emily was approaching the boundaries of acceptable behavior for someone of her rank. The conversation ended with polite acknowledgments and professional smiles. But Emily felt something fundamental shift inside her as Bennett left. For over a year, she had accepted the limitations that others placed on her role, telling herself that serving in any capacity was valuable, that supporting others was as important as leading them. But now, faced with the certainty that people were about to die because her expertise wasn't considered credible enough to act upon, those limitations felt like betrayal. She spent the next 30 minutes in a state of internal warfare, torn between military discipline and moral responsibility. The radio traffic told an increasingly clear story. Enemy forces were in position, SEAL Team Bravo was approaching the insertion point, and disaster was approaching with the precision of a coordinated military operation. Everything in her training said to follow orders, trust the chain of command, and accept that some decisions were above her pay grade. But everything in her conscience said that following orders while people died was complicity, not service. At 1,715 hours, she heard SEAL Team Bravo's final check-in before radio silence. Two voices she'd never heard before, belonging to men whose names she didn't know, confirming their approach to what she was certain was their destruction. The professional calm in their voices made it worse somehow. knowing that they were walking confidently toward a trap because the intelligence that could save them was trapped in bureaucratic procedures and institutional skepticism. The encrypted transmission that changed everything came through Emily's headphones at 1847 hours, crackling with the unmistakable urgency of soldiers in immediate danger. Through the tactical frequency she wasn't officially authorized to monitor, she heard the voice of SEAL Team Bravo's leader, his professional calm barely masking the desperation of their situation. Base, this is Neptune 7. We are under heavy fire. I repeat, we are under heavy fire. Team leader down with multiple gunshot wounds. Second team member critically injured with shrapnel wounds to the torso and legs, requesting immediate medical evacuation. The transmission was broken by static and the distant sound of automatic weapons fire, but the message was devastatingly clear. Emily's unauthorized warning hadn't reached them in time. The ambush she'd predicted had happened exactly as her intelligence analysis had suggested it would. And now 2 Navy SEALs were dying in the Syrian desert because the military bureaucracy had been too slow and too skeptical to act on information that could have saved them. The response from Base Command was immediate but problematic. Neptune 7, this is Base Actual. We have no available medical evacuation assets in your sector. Nearest helicopter is 40 minutes out. Weather conditions are deteriorating, and your position is too hot for standard extraction protocols. Major Harris's voice carried the weight of someone making calculations between acceptable losses and available resources. Neptune 7, team leader is losing blood fast. He needs surgical intervention within the next 30 minutes, or we're going to lose him. Can you provide any alternative extraction options? The SEAL's voice was growing more strained, and Emily Carter could hear the sounds of ongoing combat in the background. Neptune 7, all available aircraft are committed to operations in sectors Alpha and Delta. Engineering is working on alternative solutions, but you need to hold your position and continue applying first aid until extraction becomes feasible. The response was bureaucratically correct and tactically useless. Hold position while under fire, treat wounds that required surgical intervention, and wait for resources that might not arrive in time. Emily listened to this exchange with growing horror, knowing that she was hearing men die because the system designed to protect them was constrained by resources, procedures, and risk assessments that prioritized institutional concerns over individual lives. The enemy frequency she'd been monitoring had gone quiet, suggesting that their ambush had been successful, and they were now consolidating their position to prevent any rescue attempts. What happened next changed everything. Through her comprehensive monitoring of all frequencies in the operational area, Emily detected something that Base Command had missed. Enemy communications indicating they were preparing to move their position, abandoning the ambush site to avoid potential retaliation. There would be a brief window, perhaps 30 minutes, when the area around SEAL Team Bravo's position would be relatively clear of enemy forces. She also knew something else that Base Command apparently didn't. The terrain in Sector Charlie included several features that could serve as improvised landing zones for smaller aircraft or ground vehicles if someone with detailed topographical knowledge could guide an extraction team to the right locations. Her months of unofficial map study and terrain analysis had revealed approaches that weren't visible in standard satellite imagery but could be navigated by someone with the right preparation. Emily stared at her radio equipment, realizing that she possessed all the pieces necessary to coordinate a successful extraction. Detailed intelligence about enemy movements, comprehensive knowledge of the terrain, medical training sufficient to stabilize wounded soldiers, and technical expertise to guide rescue operations through complex communication challenges. What she lacked was authorization to use any of those capabilities. The next transmission from Neptune 7 was weaker, more desperate. Base Actual, Team Leader's pulse is getting thready. I'm not sure he's going to make it another 30 minutes. Is there any way to expedite extraction? Behind his words, Emily could hear the sounds of someone trying to remain professional while watching a teammate die. Major Harris's response was measured but grim. Neptune 7, we're exploring all available options. Continue first aid procedures and maintain your position. Help is coming, but you need to hold on. Help is coming, the phrase that military personnel used when they couldn't honestly say that help would arrive in time, when procedure required optimism even in hopeless situations. Emily had heard it used before, usually in situations where soldiers died while waiting for resources that were committed elsewhere or solutions that took too long to implement. She thought about SEAL Team Bravo, 2 men whose names she still didn't know, bleeding in the desert while bureaucrats calculated acceptable risk levels and resource allocation formulas. She thought about her months of preparation, all the skills she'd acquired and knowledge she'd accumulated that officially weren't her responsibility but personally had become her obsession. And she thought about the choice that every soldier eventually faced, whether to follow orders that felt wrong or to act according to principles that transcended institutional authority. She'd spent over a year following orders, staying in her assigned lane, accepting that others knew better than she did about where her capabilities could be useful. Now, listening to men die while she possessed the knowledge and skills that might save them. Following orders felt like the greater betrayal. Emily looked at her personal gear, at the medical supplies and navigation equipment she'd been quietly accumulating, at the radio frequencies that could guide her to SEAL Team Bravo's position. The realization hit Emily like a physical blow as she calculated the distances, the terrain, and the timeline involved in reaching SEAL Team Bravo. According to official protocols, their position was unreachable by ground forces in time to make a medical difference. The nearest vehicles were committed to other operations. Helicopter extraction was impossible due to enemy fire, and base command was essentially waiting for the SEALs to either hold out until resources became available or die while trying. But Emily's unofficial preparation had revealed possibilities that weren't visible through official channels. Her detailed study of local terrain had identified a series of goat paths and dry creek beds that could be navigated on foot, cutting the travel time to Neptune 7's position from hours to approximately 90 minutes. More importantly, her analysis of enemy communication patterns suggested that their forces were already beginning to withdraw from the immediate area, having achieved their objective of ambushing the SEAL team. Standing in her communications bunker, surrounded by the equipment that had defined her military role for over a year, Emily recognized the moment that would define her as a soldier. She possessed the tactical knowledge to reach SEAL Team Bravo, the medical training to stabilize their wounds, and the communication expertise to coordinate their extraction. What she didn't possess was official authorization to leave her assigned position and conduct an unauthorized rescue mission. The conversation she'd overheard earlier between Captain Walker and Major Harris suddenly took on new significance. If there were genuine threats in Sector Charlie, they would have identified them through proper channels. The assumption wasn't just that official intelligence was more reliable than her analysis, but that someone like her couldn't possibly possess the comprehensive understanding necessary to assess and respond to complex tactical situations. That assumption was about to be tested against reality. Emily began methodically preparing for what she knew would either be the most important mission of her career or a court-martial offense that ended it. From her personal supplies, she gathered advanced medical equipment that exceeded standard issue for communications personnel. Trauma bandages designed for arterial bleeding, surgical clamps that could be used in field conditions, pain medication that could keep wounded soldiers conscious during transport, and antibiotics that could prevent infection in contaminated wounds. Her navigation equipment told a similar story of preparation that exceeded assigned duties. The digital GPS unit she'd purchased with personal funds included topographical software that revealed terrain features invisible on standard military maps. The digital compass was calibrated for the specific magnetic variations in their operational area. The backup radio equipment included frequencies and encryption codes that would allow her to maintain communication with multiple units simultaneously. Most significantly, her tactical gear reflected months of careful acquisition and modification. The body armor had been fitted specifically for her frame but designed to carry additional weight if necessary. The combat harness included attachment points for medical supplies, communication equipment, and rescue gear. Even her boots had been selected for the specific terrain challenges of their operational area. As she loaded her equipment, Emily realized that she'd been unconsciously preparing for this exact scenario for months. Every piece of gear had been chosen for its utility in situations where a single soldier might need to provide medical care, tactical communication, and logistical support simultaneously. She'd created a loadout designed for someone who might need to operate independently in complex tactical environments. The irony wasn't lost on her that all this preparation had been dismissed as inappropriate because it exceeded her official role. The same comprehensive readiness that would be praised in a special forces operator was considered presumptuous in a communications specialist. But comprehensive readiness was exactly what SEAL Team Bravo needed. Someone who could reach them, treat their wounds, and coordinate their extraction without requiring additional rescue assets that weren't available. At 2,334 hours, Emily Carter made her final check of SEAL Team Bravo's position using triangulation techniques she'd learned during her unofficial intelligence training. They were approximately 8.2 kilometers from the base, positioned in terrain that offered concealment but limited escape routes. Enemy forces appeared to have withdrawn to positions that would allow them to observe potential rescue attempts without exposing themselves to retaliation. The tactical situation was complex but not impossible, assuming someone with the right combination of skills could navigate the approach without triggering renewed enemy contact. Someone who understood both the technical requirements of battlefield medicine and the practical challenges of desert navigation. Someone who had spent months preparing for situations that officially weren't their responsibility. The perimeter of forward operating Base Crimson at night was a carefully orchestrated balance of security and routine. Emily approached the eastern checkpoint where Corporal Johnson maintained watch, her heart pounding against her ribs as she prepared to execute the most audacious deception of her military career. Everything depended on appearing routine while undertaking anything but routine actions. "Evening patrol, Johnson," she called out casually, shouldering her pack as if conducting standard communication maintenance. "Got reports of radio dead zones in Grid Square 7 Alpha. Need to check the relay stations before morning operations." The lie came smoothly, rehearsed during her walk across the base, supported by technical details that would satisfy casual inspection. Johnson glanced at her equipment, noting the communication gear and technical supplies that justified her presence outside the wire after hours. "Kind of late for maintenance work, Carter. Can't this wait until daylight?" His question was routine rather than suspicious, the kind of mild curiosity that guards were trained to express when personnel requested after-hours access. "Negative. If there are communication failures during tomorrow's operations, Command will want to know why we didn't address them when first reported." Emily kept her voice professionally neutral, drawing on her established reputation as someone who took technical responsibilities seriously. "I'll be back within 3 hours, assuming the problems are standard equipment issues." The authorization she showed Johnson was genuine, a standing order that allowed communications personnel to conduct maintenance outside the perimeter when technical requirements demanded immediate attention. What wasn't genuine was her intended destination or the purpose of her mission. She was using legitimate protocols to justify illegitimate actions, exploiting the trust that her technical competence had earned over months of reliable service. As she walked into the Syrian desert, Emily felt the weight of crossing from authorized duty into unauthorized territory. Behind her, forward operating Base Crimson continued its routine operations, unaware that one of their communication specialists was undertaking a solo rescue mission that violated multiple regulations and could result in a court-martial if discovered. Ahead of her, SEAL Team Bravo's position waited like a beacon of moral clarity in a landscape of bureaucratic complexity. The navigation route she'd planned took her through terrain that was invisible to standard military mapping but perfectly suited for undetected movement. The dry creek beds and goat paths she'd identified during months of topographical study provided concealment from observation while allowing relatively rapid movement toward her objective. Her unauthorized preparation was finally serving its intended purpose. Moving through the desert at night required skills that weren't part of standard communications training but were essential for independent operations. Emily used natural navigation techniques to maintain her bearing, recognized terrain features by their silhouettes against the star-filled sky, and moved with the careful silence of someone who understood that detection meant failure. Her small stature, so often cited as a limitation, became an advantage in terrain that rewarded stealth over strength. The enemy communication she monitored through her portable radio confirmed that hostile forces were withdrawing from their ambush positions, confident that their mission had been accomplished. They weren't expecting a rescue attempt, certainly not one conducted by a single soldier moving independently through terrain they considered impassable for military vehicles. Their tactical assumptions were about to encounter Emily's determination to prove them wrong. At 2,147 hours, she established radio contact with SEAL Team Bravo using encrypted frequencies that weren't part of standard communications base. "Neptune 7, this is Guardian Angel. I'm approximately 2 kilometers from your position, approaching from the southeast. What's your current status?" The call sign was improvised, chosen to avoid identification while establishing her rescue intentions. The first thing Emily noticed as she approached SEAL Team Bravo's position was the blood. Dark stains in the sand caught the moonlight, creating a trail that told the story of two men trying to find cover while seriously wounded. The second thing she noticed was the alertness of the conscious SEAL, his weapon trained on her approach despite obvious pain from his own injuries. Neptune 7, this is Guardian Angel. I'm 50 meters from your position, approaching from your 7 o'clock. Please acknowledge visual contact. She kept her voice low, using the tactical communication protocols she'd learned during her unauthorized training while moving with deliberate slowness to avoid triggering defensive reactions. Guardian Angel, I have visual. Single operator moving from the southeast. The SEAL's voice carried amazement tinged with suspicion. You're smaller than I expected for someone conducting solo rescue operations in hostile territory. Even in their desperate situation, her size was generating doubt about her capabilities. Neptune 7, size is irrelevant when you're bleeding out. I'm approaching your position now for medical assessment. Emily moved into their defensive perimeter, immediately focusing on the wounded team leader while maintaining awareness of their tactical situation. Her medical training took over, pushing aside the significance of the moment in favor of practical life-saving requirements. The team leader, Staff Sergeant David Miller, according to his name tape, was unconscious with multiple gunshot wounds to the torso and left leg. His breathing was shallow and rapid, indicating shock from blood loss, while his pulse was weak but regular. The tactical situation had prevented proper wound care, leaving field dressings that were inadequate for arterial bleeding and internal injuries that required surgical intervention. How long has he been unconscious? Emily asked while examining Miller's wounds, her hands moving with a competence that months of medical training had developed. She established 4-access using equipment that exceeded standard issue for communications personnel, administering fluids to combat shock while assessing the severity of his injuries. About 30 minutes. Lost a lot of blood before we could get effective pressure on the wounds. The conscious SEAL, Petty Officer Ryan Thompson, watched her work with professional interest despite his own obvious pain. Are you really a communications specialist? Because you're working like someone with serious medical training. I'm someone with the training you need and the determination to get you both home alive. Emily avoided detailed explanations while focusing on stabilizing Miller for transport. The abdominal wound was her primary concern, suggesting internal bleeding that could be fatal without surgical repair. Her field treatment could buy time, but only if she could coordinate extraction within the next few hours. Thompson's injuries were less immediately life-threatening but still serious. Shrapnel wounds to his right thigh and shoulder that had been properly dressed but limited his mobility. He could walk with assistance but couldn't carry Miller independently, making extraction a complex logistical challenge that required both medical stability and tactical movement. Guardian Angel, how exactly are you planning to extract 2 wounded SEALs from hostile territory without air support or ground vehicles? His question reflected the same institutional thinking that had prevented official rescue attempts, that extraction required resources and authorization that weren't currently available. Neptune 7, I'm planning to walk you out. The enemy forces have withdrawn from their ambush positions, creating a movement corridor that leads back toward friendly territory. It's approximately 8 kilometers through terrain that's passable on foot if we're careful about our route. Selection. Emily Carter continued working while explaining her plan, demonstrating the multitasking capability that her unauthorized training had developed. 8 kilometers. Miller can't walk 8 meters in his condition, let alone 8 kilometers through desert terrain. His objection was tactically sound but reflected conventional thinking about evacuation procedures that required either vehicle transport or helicopter extraction. He doesn't need to walk. I'm going to carry him. Emily's statement was delivered with matter-of-fact confidence, as if carrying an unconscious man through hostile territory was a routine part of communications duties. I prepared for this scenario, including the physical requirements and logistical challenges. The silence that followed was obviously filled with Thompson's disbelief. Guardian Angel, no offense, but you're maybe 130 pounds. Miller weighs 180 pounds before equipment. The physics doesn't work for an 8 kilometers carry through desert terrain. His assessment was mathematically accurate and tactically reasonable, reflecting standard assumptions about physical limitations and carrying capacity. The Syrian desert at night became Emily's proving ground. Every step a test of preparation that had been dismissed as inappropriate for someone of her assigned duties. Carrying Miller across her shoulders using the specialized evacuation system, she moved through terrain that combined the challenges of desert navigation with the complexity of tactical movement while supporting wounded personnel. The first hour tested her physical conditioning in ways that gymnasium workouts couldn't replicate. Miller's weight, distributed across her frame through the harness system, created a burden that demanded constant adjustment of balance and breathing. Her legs, strengthened through months of endurance training that others had considered excessive for communications personnel, found their rhythm in the soft sand and broken rock of the desert floor. Thompson moved beside her with obvious difficulty, his shrapnel wounds limiting mobility, while his professional pride prevented him from accepting more assistance than absolutely necessary. "Guardian Angel," he said during their first brief rest stop, "I've got to ask how you developed the physical capability for this kind of operation. This isn't standard communications training." Neptune 7, "I developed it the same way you develop SEAL capabilities. Through preparation that exceeded minimum requirements and training that anticipated worst-case scenarios." Emily adjusted Miller's position in the evacuation harness, checking his pulse and breathing while maintaining tactical awareness of their surroundings. "The difference is that my preparation was considered inappropriate, while yours was considered essential." The navigation challenges proved more complex than her planning had anticipated. Desert terrain at night transformed familiar landmarks into confusing shadows, while the weight of Miller made precise movement more difficult than her training exercises had simulated. But her months of topographical study paid dividends as she recognized subtle terrain features that guided their route toward safety. At 0127 hours, they encountered their first major obstacle, a rocky ridge that blocked their direct route toward friendly territory. The terrain feature hadn't been clearly visible in satellite imagery but appeared impassable for someone carrying wounded personnel. Standard military doctrine would have required either finding an alternative route that added hours to their travel time or calling for support that wasn't available. Emily studied the obstacle with eyes trained through months of terrain analysis, identifying a narrow path that curved around the eastern face of the ridge. The route was steep and dangerous, requiring careful footwork while maintaining balance under load, but it was passable for someone with appropriate preparation and determination. "Guardian Angel, that path looks pretty risky for someone carrying a casualty," Thompson observed, his tactical training identifying the same hazards that concerned her. "Maybe we should look for an alternative route that's more stable." His suggestion reflected standard risk assessment procedures that prioritized safety over speed. Neptune 7, "Alternative routes add 2 hours to our movement time. Miller's medical condition doesn't allow for extended delays." Emily began the careful ascent using climbing techniques she'd developed during her unauthorized physical training. Sometimes the risky route is the safest option when time is the critical factor. The climb tested every aspect of her preparation. The specialized boots she'd selected for desert operations provided crucial traction on loose rock. The modified pack frame distributed Miller's weight efficiently during steep ascents. Most importantly, the mental discipline she developed through months of physical challenges kept her focused on immediate tasks rather than the consequences of failure. Thompson followed her lead with growing respect, his own SEAL training allowing him to recognize the technical competence that her movement demonstrated. "Guardian Angel, where did you learn climbing techniques this advanced? This isn't something you pick up through casual training." His questions reflected professional curiosity rather than skeptical dismissal. Neptune 7, "I learned at the same place I learned medical procedures, tactical analysis, and desert navigation. Through preparation that other people considered excessive for someone of my assigned role. Turns out excessive preparation becomes essential capability when lives depend on it." The descent proved more challenging than the ascent, requiring controlled movement while preventing Miller from shifting position in ways that could destabilize their balance. Emily used rope techniques to manage the steep sections, equipment that she'd acquired through her unofficial gear procurement but had never expected to use in actual rescue operations. At 0243 hours, they reached level terrain and continued their movement toward extraction coordinates that existed only in Emily's planning. The route she'd identified using topographical analysis and enemy movement patterns was proving accurate. but the physical demands of carrying Miller were beginning to accumulate in ways that threatened their mission success. "Guardian Angel," Thompson said during their next rest stop, "you're starting to show fatigue. Maybe we should redistribute the load somehow." His offer reflected both tactical pragmatism and growing confidence in her capabilities, a recognition that she was qualified to make decisions about their extraction. The first hint of dawn was bleeding across the eastern horizon when Emily spotted the familiar outline of forward operating Base Crimson's perimeter defenses. After 4 hours of movement through hostile territory, carrying Miller and guiding Thompson across terrain that officially couldn't be navigated on foot, they had reached friendly territory with both SEALs alive and their medical conditions stabilized. The base guard towers came into view at 0547 hours, their searchlights sweeping the approaches in routine security patterns. Emily used her radio to contact the perimeter watch, knowing that her return would trigger questions that she wasn't entirely prepared to answer. "Base perimeter, this is Guardian Angel returning with wounded personnel requiring immediate medical attention." The response carried confusion and disbelief in equal measure. "Guardian Angel, this is Base perimeter. We don't have any call sign Guardian Angel on our operational roster. Identify yourself and state your mission authorization." The guard's professional skepticism reflected standard security protocols for unidentified personnel approaching the base. "Base perimeter, this is Specialist Carter from Communications, returning with SEAL Team Bravo casualties. I have 1 critical and 1 walking wounded, requiring immediate medical evacuation." Emily kept her explanation factual while approaching the main gate, where the duty officer would have to reconcile her presence with official records of personnel assignments. "Specialist Carter, wait one while we verify your status." The pause that followed suggested rapid consultation with base command, probably discovering that the communication specialist who should have been manning radio equipment in the bunker was instead approaching from hostile territory with wounded SEALs that everyone had assumed were beyond rescue. The guard tower searchlight illuminated their small group, revealing the impossible scene that would force base command to confront everything they thought they knew about resource limitations and individual capabilities. Emily Carter, the 130 pounds communication specialist who had been deemed too small for operational duties, was carrying a wounded SEAL across her shoulders while guiding another toward medical attention that official resources hadn't been able to provide. "Jesus Christ!" came a voice. Over the radio, breaking protocol in the shock of recognition. She actually did it. Carter actually reached them. The transmission suggested that word of her unauthorized mission had spread through base communications, creating awareness that she had attempted something that everyone had considered impossible. The main gate opened as medical personnel rushed toward their position, drawn by reports that had seemed too incredible to believe. Captain Andrews, the base medical officer, reached them first, immediately beginning assessment of Miller while trying to understand how wounded personnel had been extracted from a position that helicopter rescue couldn't reach. "Specialist Carter," Andrews said while establishing for access for Miller, "how did you manage to extract wounded personnel from Grid Square 7 Alpha? We've been monitoring that sector, and it's been considered inaccessible to ground forces." His questions reflected professional amazement rather than bureaucratic skepticism. "Sir, I used terrain analysis to identify movement corridors that weren't visible in standard mapping, combined with specialized equipment and techniques that enabled casualty evacuation under conditions that traditional methods couldn't address." Emily helped transfer Miller to the medical stretcher, her own exhaustion becoming apparent as the adrenaline of the mission began to subside. Thompson, despite his own wounds, provided context that transformed official understanding of what had occurred. "This woman," he said, gesturing toward Emily while receiving medical attention, "conducted a solo rescue mission through hostile territory, carrying my team leader 8 kilometers through terrain that I wouldn't have thought possible for one person, let alone someone hauling a casualty." The gathering crowd of personnel included officers and enlisted soldiers who had known Emily as the quiet communication specialist who fixed radio equipment and filed reports. Seeing her return from an unauthorized rescue mission that had saved lives when official resources had failed created cognitive dissonance that forced everyone to reconsider their assumptions about her capabilities. Major Harris appeared at the medical facility as Miller was being prepared for transport to the surgical unit. His expression combined relief at the successful extraction with concern about the unauthorized nature of the operation. "Specialist Carter," he said, his tone carefully neutral, We need to discuss exactly how this extraction was accomplished and why it was undertaken without proper authorization. Sir, I used monitored enemy communications that indicated SEAL Team Bravo was in immediate danger from an ambush that I had previously reported through proper channels. When official resources weren't available for extraction, I used capabilities that I had developed independently to reach them before their medical conditions became fatal. The debriefing room at Forward Operating Base Crimson had never hosted a session quite like this one. At 1,400 hours, 12 hours after her unauthorized return with wounded SEALs, Emily sat facing a panel that included Colonel Wilson from Regional Command, Major Harris from Base Intelligence, Captain Walker from Operations, and Captain Bennett from Communications. The atmosphere carried the tension of an institution grappling with success that violated every protocol they were designed to enforce. Specialist Carter, your actions over the past 24 hours have created a situation that challenges fundamental assumptions about individual initiative, chain of command, and operational authorization. We are here to understand exactly what occurred and determine appropriate responses. Sir, I conducted an unauthorized rescue mission to extract SEAL Team Bravo from Grid Square 7 Alpha after official resources were deemed insufficient for timely extraction. Major Harris leaned forward, consulting the thick file of documentation that had been assembled overnight. Specialist Carter, your intelligence analysis regarding enemy activity in Sector Charlie proved accurate. The ambush you predicted occurred exactly as you described, with timing and methods that matched your assessment. The question is why you felt authorized to act on intelligence that hadn't been validated through proper channels. Sir, I felt morally obligated to act when I possessed information and capabilities that could save lives that would otherwise be lost while waiting for proper validation and authorization. Emily's response addressed the institutional concern while asserting a principle that transcended bureaucratic procedures. SEAL Team Bravo needed immediate assistance that only I could provide. Captain Walker spoke with the controlled frustration of someone whose authority had been openly challenged by successful insubordination. Specialist Carter, military discipline exists precisely to prevent individual soldiers from making unauthorized decisions about life and death situations. If everyone decided for themselves when to follow orders, we'd have chaos instead of effective military operations. Sir, I understand the importance of military discipline, but I also understand that rigid adherence to procedures can prevent effective action when circumstances exceed standard operational parameters. Emily met Walker's gaze without backing down, her respect for rank balanced by confidence in her tactical assessment. Sometimes individual initiative is necessary to achieve institutional objectives. The panel exchanged glances that suggested they were navigating uncharted territory between competing military values. Obedience versus results, institutional authority versus individual conscience, procedural compliance versus mission success. Colonel Wilson consulted his notes before addressing the fundamental question that would determine Emily's future. Specialist Carter, let's address your qualifications for conducting solo rescue operations in hostile territory. Your personnel file indicates communications specialty with no advanced combat training, no medical certification beyond basic first aid, and no authorization for independent operations. How do you justify undertaking missions that exceed your official capabilities? Sir, my official capabilities don't reflect my actual capabilities. Over the past 14 months, I've pursued additional training in medical procedures, tactical analysis, terrain navigation, and combat operations because I recognize that my assigned duties might require expanded skill sets in complex operational environments. Emily's response revealed the comprehensive nature of her unofficial preparation while challenging the assumption that job descriptions defined individual potential. Colonel Specialist Carter's technical performance has consistently exceeded standards. Her intelligence analysis, even when it fell outside her assigned duties, has proven accurate in multiple instances. The question isn't whether she possessed relevant capabilities, but whether she was authorized to use them. The distinction highlighted the central tension of the proceedings. Emily had demonstrated competence that exceeded official expectations, but had done so through channels that violated military protocols. Her success vindicated her capabilities while challenging the institutional frameworks that had prevented those capabilities from being officially recognized and utilized. 6 months after her unauthorized rescue mission, Staff Sergeant Emily Carter stood before a formation of personnel at Forward Operating Base Crimson, her new rank and assignment reflecting institutional recognition of capabilities that had once been dismissed as inappropriate for someone of her background and physical characteristics. The ceremony honoring her actions and the broader changes they had prompted marked a transformation that extended far beyond individual recognition to systematic evolution of military culture. Colonel Wilson addressed the assembled personnel with observations that captured the significance of what one soldier's refusal to accept limitations had accomplished. Staff Sergeant Carter's unauthorized rescue mission saved 2 lives and transformed how this institution identifies and utilizes the capabilities of our personnel. Her actions proved that competence can exist in unexpected forms, that individual initiative can achieve results that institutional resources cannot provide, and that sometimes the most important military action is refusing to accept institutional limitations on individual potential. The commendation ceremony included both Navy SEALs whose lives Emily had saved 6 months earlier. Staff Sergeant Miller, fully recovered from his wounds, provided testimony that placed her actions in context that military efficiency reports couldn't capture. Staff Sergeant Carter reached us when official rescue assets couldn't, treated wounds that would have been fatal without immediate attention, and carried me 8 kilometers through hostile territory using capabilities that no one knew she possessed. She didn't just save our lives. She proved that being underestimated can become a tactical advantage when combined with genuine preparation. Petty Officer Thompson added perspective that addressed the broader implications of her success. What impressed me most wasn't just her physical capability or technical expertise, but her comprehensive understanding of how different skills combine to solve complex problems. She approached our rescue like someone who had been preparing for that exact scenario because she had been preparing, even though no one had asked her to. The recognition extended beyond individual commendation to acknowledgement of systematic changes that Emily's actions had prompted throughout the command structure. The tactical support division that she now led included personnel whose diverse expertise had been identified through new evaluation procedures designed to recognize capabilities that transcended traditional specialty boundaries. Major Harris, now responsible for implementing the intelligence assessment protocols that Emily's accurate ambush prediction had made necessary, addressed the cultural transformation that her actions had catalyzed. Staff Sergeant Carter's unauthorized intelligence gathering proved more accurate than official assessment procedures because her technical expertise allowed her to recognize patterns that traditional analysis missed. We've learned that effective intelligence requires input from personnel with specialized knowledge, regardless of their assigned duties. Today, I lead a division that provides tactical support capabilities that didn't exist through conventional organizational structures. The difference isn't that I became more capable, but that the institution became more effective at recognizing and utilizing capabilities that already existed but went unacknowledged. Her words addressed every soldier who had been told they were too small, too quiet, too technical, or too different to contribute beyond narrow specializations. Her success had created precedents that opened opportunities for others whose potential exceeded official recognition. The most important lesson from my unauthorized mission isn't that individuals should ignore orders, but that institutions should recognize capabilities wherever they exist and create opportunities for personnel to contribute to mission success using the full range of their abilities. Emily's analysis reflected understanding that individual initiative worked best when institutional adaptation prompted, rather than simply challenging, institutional authority. As personnel dispersed from the ceremony, many approached Emily with accounts of how her example had encouraged them to pursue additional training, to develop expertise beyond assigned duties, and to contribute capabilities that hadn't been officially recognized. Her unauthorized rescue had authorized a cultural transformation that encouraged excellence rather than limiting it to predetermined categories. The legacy recognition was complete. Emily Carter had transformed from an overlooked communication specialist into a leader whose example proved that being underestimated created opportunities to exceed expectations, and that exceeding expectations could inspire systematic changes that benefited everyone who refused to accept artificial limitations on their potential to serve. Her story had become institutional memory. Proof that sometimes the most important thing a soldier could do was prove that conventional wisdom about individual limitations could be wrong, and that being wrong about limitations created opportunities to be right about possibilities that no one had previously imagined. The woman they had once called too small for missions had led the most important mission of all, transforming how an entire institution thought about the relationship between individual potential and collective effectiveness.